And I want to talk, some of you have seen this research. I want to talk about research that Hewlett commissioned. It was again based on a survey of 167 respondents, $5 million in grant making or more, private and community foundations, as well as 40+ in-depth interviews with foundation CEOs, fascinating interviews. The research report came out at the end of the last year. It was written by Ellie Buteau, Naomi Orenston, and Karis Lowe of CEP. And there's also a companion piece of 8 CEO essays that you may have seen. Conducted pre-election, but I think you'll see relevant. We asked foundation leaders, what are the most pressing issues that will face society in the coming decades? I don't think you're going to be shocked by what they are, but it's interesting to see the level of agreement, particularly about the first one. 65% talked about wealth and inequality. So this was a pressing issue that will influence society. It also came up as the most frequent answer to a question about pressing issues that will influence foundation philanthropy. And this is all before any tax reform efforts. So people talked about wealth disparities. They talked about opportunity gaps. They talked about shrinking middle class, massive inequalities all over the globe. And obviously we'll go deep on this issue tomorrow with Raj Chetty and leaders from 3 large foundations working from various angles on this issue of inequality. The others on the list of the top 3 aren't going to surprise you either, I don't think. Climate change and the environment was second. Those working on this issue obviously are facing arguably new challenges, even in the wake of last week's executive order. But when people talked last year to us about this issue, they said things like, look, climate change is going to impact the entire world and already is, whether you believe it or not. Third issue was education. Education seen globally and domestically as a pathway to greater opportunity. And again, all 3 of these issues obviously have been affected by the new administration. But the question that we were interested in is, okay, if there are these important pressing issues, how much of a difference can foundations even make in the eyes of foundation leaders? What even is the potential for impact? So we asked that question, and here is fairly affirming, I think. So we did have, when we asked how much of a difference is it possible for foundations to make, somebody was having a bad day. But generally there was a sense, no, foundations can make a difference. 31% said a moderate difference. 67% of foundation leaders said foundations can make a significant difference. But then we asked, how much of a difference are foundations making today? Again, bad day. A slight difference, 29%. 57% a moderate difference, and only 13% a significant difference. So a striking disconnect between foundation leaders' self-appraisal of what is possible in terms of foundation contribution and what is actually happening. Why? Why aren't foundations maximizing their opportunity to make a difference in the eyes of foundation leaders themselves? We asked about barriers. And when we coded the responses to understand, well, what were the barriers, we realized foundation leaders weren't pointing the finger externally. They pointed the finger internally. 62% cited internal barriers that were getting in the way of foundations maximizing their opportunity for impact. Many of these result from dynamics that are in the foundation CEO's ability to influence. But there was frustration about lack of internal agreement on the nature of goals, or too many goals. This CEO said, we have too many focused areas, creating shallow knowledge in these areas, and too much division of resources. People talked about undisciplined implementation of strategy. They talked about operations, management, culture, and alignment. One CEO said, we still have a passive grant-making culture and not enough of a whatever it takes mindset. Folks talked about lack of board staff alignment, unclear decision-making. Some talked about a lack of bravery, a fear of failure. Again, all things you would think within the purview of the leader to influence, but frustration about them nonetheless. And so we'll talk in our closing plenary, which I'm super excited about with Nancy Kane, about leadership and what gets in the way of making these kinds of changes. But it wasn't just internal barriers, of course. People noted that it's a tough climate, a tough environment in which to work. People talked about the broader external context and said things like problems are related to underlying systems, and systems reform requires collaboration, patience, and time. People talked about political and economic realities, gridlock, inequality, and they talked also about the resources relative to the problem. So I think foundation leaders recognize that it looks to outside observers like they've got a lot of resources, but relative to the problems, how significant are those resources really? And that realization connects to a sense that came through again and again that more and better collaboration is needed. And this is one of these things like, people sometimes talk about collaboration like somebody just thought of it. This is, I think, the first philanthropy conference I ever went to, which was like 16 years ago. The theme was collaboration. And yet, this frustration. So, and it came up in many ways through this study, but it actually came up as a barrier to better performance. So I just want to share some of the things that people said when they talked about it. So one CEO talked about I want you to collaborate with me, but I don't want to collaborate with you mentality. Another discussed ego, lack of collaboration, people stuff. So foundation leaders, and I would say that, Ellie and Naomi were really struck by the interviews, by the level of self-critique, and maybe angst is too strong a word, but I'm not sure, that came through about what was required of foundations, the pressing challenges that they knew were on the horizon. Maybe they didn't know that they would be as pressing as they now feel. And also but they had skepticism about the ability of foundations to rise to the challenge, to make the change necessary. They did talk about the unique role of foundations. So going back to how I opened, I think there was a shared recognition that foundations can do certain things that others can't. And the leaders talked about things like experimenting and innovating, convening and collaborating was another one, again, collaboration, catalyzing change and thought leadership, long-range thinking. But we were curious, are there specific practices? We didn't think there'd be like a magic bullet, but are there specific practices that are seen as having significant opportunity to unlock greater impact? And we asked about 24. We vetted this list with various folks, and all the usual suspects were on it, like scaling proven programs or impact investing, but those were not the highest on the list, not even close. When we asked about these practices, I'll tell you what the most frequently selected for having a lot of ability to increase foundation impact were. And they surprised us. They surprised us to the extent we worried we wouldn't be credible presenters of this data because they so related to the things that we're trying to work on, learning from the experience of those they are trying to help, learning from the knowledge or experience of grantees, taking more risk, and again, this theme, collaboration. So, I think that what this shows us is foundation leaders are well aware of the dangers of living in a bubble long before everybody was talking about living in a bubble. And foundation leaders know that they're in a particular bubble, surrounded by positivity by virtue of the resources that they have control over. And the recognition that these things are important is significant. But as I think you would probably all agree, that doesn't necessarily translate into doing these things with the same level of frequency. And I would share one sort of personal example to illustrate this. Learning from the experience of those they are ultimately trying to help was something that Faye Tversky, when she was at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, raised with us at CEP in the context of the potential for a pilot or an experiment. And we launched, with the help of folks at CEP, including Valerie Threlfall, who is here, a program called Youth Truth, which is now led by Jen Voris-Wilke, who is also here. Youth Truth is cool, and it is an effort to hear from kids in schools, and now parents and staff too, about their experience on all kinds of different dimensions like climate and culture, academic rigor, bullying. And this is not just like feel-good data. Perceptual data has been shown to be linked to outcomes in both education and also in healthcare. So this can be an important set of leading indicators. And Youth Truth, and I don't mean to give it an infomercial here, but Youth Truth has had a lot of success in getting districts and schools and chartered management organizations to make change. We have had, and maybe it's on us, maybe we haven't shared the data up in the right way, less success getting even the generous education funders who've provided it significant philanthropic support, without which it wouldn't exist, to actually make use of the data for their own work, for their own strategies. And yet, my thought is, isn't your strategy going to be better if you know what the people you're trying to help think about how it's playing out? Now, I use that example because I know it, but we could say the same about collaboration. In fact, I just did. That there's this disconnect between the recognition that this is what we need to do, and I'm not saying it's easy. That's the point. How do we then do it? So that's sort of what I want to focus on with you now. So what I see here in these results is that foundation CEOs see pressing issues on the horizon, but don't believe that they're fulfilling their potential today. And people said, to us, that's a brutal finding. And I don't know about that, because it also shows a level of self-critique and impatience for better results that I found kind of encouraging. There wasn't a lot of self-satisfaction. There was more self-critique, actually, in this study than what we've seen, and this is sort of anecdotal, it's not apples to apples, but in our past research. Anyway, foundation leaders also see some promising practices, like listening to and learning from grantees and beneficiaries, embracing risk, and more and better collaboration.